The hemlock trees at the ridge above Dudleytown do not merely absorb sound the way ordinary forest does. They return it to you, reshaped, wearing your own voice like a borrowed coat. My name is Reverend Caleb Marsh. I am 34 years of age, ordained through the New England Methodist Circuit in the spring of 1739, and I am giving this account to the Hartford Ecclesiastical Court of Inquiry on the 14th day of March, 1747, some 5 months after the events I am about to describe. I am giving it under oath, which I take seriously, and I am giving it in full, which I suspect the court will find uncomfortable. I have been asked to be thorough. I intend to be. I will note at the outset that I am not a man given to supernatural interpretation. My training was methodical, and my temperament has always leaned toward the practical. I say this not to establish credibility through humility, but because it is relevant to the shape of this account. What I experienced in Dudleytown in October of 1746 resisted every rational framework I carried with me. Some of it I can still explain, imperfectly. Some of it I cannot. I will identify which is which as I go, and I ask the court to trust that distinction. I will also say this before I begin. There is a thing I did on the 4th night in that hollow that I have not yet found the language to justify, though I have been searching for it since before the sun rose on October the 23rd. I will come to it. I will not evade it. That is in part why I requested this deposition rather than simply providing a written report. I wanted to say it aloud, in the presence of other men, so that it exists as a spoken truth rather than a private one. I arrived in the hill country of northwestern Connecticut in the first week of October, 1746. The circuit had received a letter from one Thomas Aldrich, a selectman from the neighboring parish of Cornwall, describing what he called an epidemic of disruption in the small settlement south of Dark Entry Road, the cluster of homes known locally as Dudleytown. 3 families had vacated their properties within a single season. This was not, in itself, alarming. Frontier homesteads fail. Weather fails them. Soil fails them. Men lose their nerve and their capital in the same season and walk away. But Aldrich's letter contained details that the circuit board felt warranted direct investigation. He described crops left standing unharvested. He described cook fires still burning inside abandoned homes, which is not the behavior of a family packing for departure. He described 2 men from one of the evacuated families who had been brought to Cornwall incoherent, unable to report what had driven them out, speaking in fragments about sounds and about something they had heard in the trees. And he described one woman, the wife of a farmer named Gideon Clark, who had arrived at the Cornwall meeting house mute and who had not spoken a word in the 6 weeks since her arrival. She was not catatonic. She was alert. Her eyes moved and tracked. She responded to her name. She simply would not produce speech, and when Aldrich had pressed her, she had looked at a point just past his left shoulder, at empty air, with an expression he described in his letter as recognition, as though she could see something standing there. I want to be clear about my initial read on all of this. Ergot contamination in rye grain was well documented by 1746 and produced exactly the kind of behavioral symptoms Aldrich described: visual disturbance, auditory disturbance, panic, incoherence, mute episodes. It had been identified as the likely cause of similar outbreak symptoms in other frontier communities, and Dudleytown's geography, a low hollow between ridges that retained moisture and shadow through most of the growing season, was precisely the kind of environment in which contaminated grain stores flourished. I arrived with that framework firmly in place, and I carried it with me for 3 days. I want the court to understand that I was not credulous when I went in. I want the court to understand how far I moved from that position by the time I came out, and what it took to move me. My traveling companion for this assessment was Deacon Samuel Hoit of the Cornwall Circuit Office. He was 22 years old. He had been ordained less than a year before and had requested to accompany me because the Cornwall assignment was quiet and he was eager for field work. He was a tall young man, broad in the shoulder, with a laugh that came easily and a habit of narrating his own skepticism about things as though skepticism were itself a spiritual posture. He had read Aldrich's letter and found it entertaining. He said, on the first morning of our ride south toward the Dudley Hollow, that the most frightening thing we were likely to encounter was bad water and superstitious farming. He was not unkind about it. He was simply young and had not yet been anywhere that challenged him. I need to tell the court about Samuel Hoit clearly, because what happened to him is the reason this deposition exists, and I need to do it without the kind of grief that clouds testimony, so I am going to describe him as accurately as I can, and then set the description aside and return to the facts. We reached the Dudleytown Hollow on the afternoon of October the 19th. The track descended from Dark Entry Road, through a corridor of hemlock and second-growth maple, the kind of passage where the light changes quality abruptly as you move from the ridge into the depression below. It is not that the hollow is dark exactly, it is that the light there is late. It arrives the way light arrives in the final hour before dusk, regardless of what the actual hour is. We descended in early afternoon, and the hollow received us in the grey-gold register of evening. Samuel remarked on it, and I noted it. I am noting it here because I want the court to understand it as a physical reality of that place, not as atmosphere. The geography of the hollow produces a specific and consistent quality of diminished light. That matters to what follows, because diminished light affects perception, and I want to give the court every mundane explanation available before I offer the ones that are not mundane. The settlement itself consisted of 7 structures when we arrived: 4 homesteads, a small mill building adjacent to the creek, a storage building, and what had served as a common house. Of the 4 homesteads, 3 were abandoned in the condition Aldrich had described. The 4th was occupied. A man named Ezra Fitch and his wife Margaret had not left, though all of their nearest neighbors had. I will say more about the Fitches shortly. They were the first people we spoke to, and what they told us shaped the first 2 days of the investigation in ways I did not fully appreciate at the time. We did not spend the first night in the hollow. We returned to the Cornwall Road and lodged at a farmstead a mile north, a family named Prentice, who had no connection to the Dudleytown settlement. Samuel thought this was overly cautious. I thought it was sensible. The following morning we went back in, and I want to describe that second visit as precisely as I can, because something occurred on that morning that I did not recognize as significant until much later, and I believe it is the pivot on which everything else turns. The Fitches received us at their door with a quality of relief that told me they had been waiting for someone official to arrive for some time. Ezra Fitch was a man perhaps 50 years of age, with the physical dimensions of someone who had spent decades doing heavy labor, and the manner of someone who had recently stopped sleeping properly. His wife Margaret was quieter, more watchful, and she had a habit, which I noticed within the first few minutes of our conversation, of turning her head toward the south window at irregular intervals, toward the hemlock ridge, as though she expected to hear something. I noted this at the time as a possible anxiety symptom, consistent with an ergot exposure that had affected her neighbors. I note it now as something else. Fitch told us what he knew about the departures. The Clark family had gone first, in late August. He said that Gideon Clark had been a rational and steady man for the 12 years he had known him, and that in the week before his family fled, Clark had become impossible to speak with. Not irrational, precisely. Not violent, but absorbed, distracted, listening to something Fitch could not hear. He described Clark standing at the edge of his property at dusk, facing the hemlock tree line along the south ridge, for long periods. Just standing. When Fitch had approached him during one of these episodes, Clark had turned and looked at him with an expression that Fitch struggled to describe. He said it was as though Clark was surprised to find a person standing there, as though he had expected someone else. The second family, the Abbotts, went in early September. Fitch knew less about their departure because by then he and Margaret had begun avoiding extended contact with their neighbors. He said this with some shame, but I did not press it. The third family left on a single night in mid-September, without, as far as Fitch knew, speaking to anyone. They were simply not there the following morning. I asked Fitch whether he had noticed any unusual sounds at night, or any evidence of intruders or animals at the perimeters of the properties. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. He said that he had heard something in the evenings from the direction of the Hemlock Ridge. He described it as a sound like someone humming to themselves, the kind of low, aimless, tuneless humming a person makes when they are working alone and not aware of being heard. He said it had begun sometime in July, and that at first he had thought it was one of his neighbors. He said it had taken him a week to understand that it was not coming from the direction of any of the homesteads, and another week beyond that to understand that it was getting closer each night, that whatever was producing the sound was advancing. He stopped speaking at this point and looked toward the south window. Margaret's head had turned that way also, without apparent awareness. I asked him what he thought was producing the sound. He said he had no opinion about that and would not offer one. Samuel and I spent that day examining the 3 abandoned homesteads. I want to describe what we found in the Clark house specifically, because that is where I found the artifact that I have submitted to this court as evidence, and because the Clark house was, of all 3, the one that most forcefully resisted the ergot interpretation I had brought with me. The house was intact. Gideon Clark had been a careful builder, and the structure was sound. The fire in the main room had burned itself out, but it had clearly been maintained until shortly before the family's departure, because the ash was dense and the stone surround was caked with the residue of prolonged use. There were dishes on the table. Not the disorder of a hasty departure, not items knocked over or broken, simply set, as for a meal that was never eaten. The bread on the board was long past eating, green and collapsed, but it had been fresh when it was placed there. Blankets on the beds, clothes in the trunk in the main bedroom. These people had left without their clothes. Samuel did not find this as alarming as I did. He suggested that people in the grip of ergot-induced panic did not pack systematically. He was right about that, technically. But the quality of stillness in that house was not consistent with panic. It was consistent with interruption, as though the family had simply stopped in the middle of an ordinary evening and walked out the door and not come back. I will come to what I found beneath the floor of that house on the second afternoon, because it is the item the court most specifically wants to hear about, and because the context of the search matters. We did not find it easily. We found it because of something Fitch said when we returned to his house at the end of the first day's examination. He told us that the Dudley family, for whom this hollow was named, had been the first settlers here. This was known. Gideon Dudley and his sons had claimed the land in the late 17th century and had established the first homesteads. What Fitch told us beyond that was local knowledge that had never, as far as I can determine, been committed to any official record. He said that the Dudley settlement had not gone well from the beginning, that the family had suffered a succession of disasters of the kind that, on any single property, would be attributed to bad luck, but which had continued across multiple properties within the hollow, suggesting something systemic. Livestock died. Crops failed in ways that neighboring farms, on the same soil, in the same season, did not experience. Members of the family suffered breakdowns of mental function that had driven several of them from the hollow and, in at least 2 cases, to their deaths. The Dudley name had died out in the hollow by the 1720s, and the properties had passed to new owners, and for a period of perhaps 15 years, the new settlers had done reasonably well. And then it had begun again. Fitch did not have a name for what he believed was happening. He was not, I should note, an ignorant man. He had read. He was a member in good standing of the Cornwall parish, and he had no investment in superstition for its own sake. But he said something to us at the end of that first evening conversation that stayed with me in a way I could not dismiss. He said that the Mohawk who had occupied this territory before the English settlers had not built in this hollow, not because of the soil or the water, both of which were adequate, because of what they knew about the place. He said they called it, in their language, something that translated approximately as the place where the land remembers what it is owed. He had this from a man, long since deceased, who had traded with the Mohawk in the 1720s. The phrase had been passed down through the Cornwall community, not as local color, but as a practical warning. Everyone in the area knew it. No one, including the Dudleys, had taken it seriously enough. We returned the following morning, our second full day in the hollow, and I began a more systematic search of the Clark house. I was looking, at that point, for evidence of the grain storage and preparation that would confirm ergot contamination. What I found instead was beneath the floorboards of the main room, in the space between the flooring planks and the earth below. Not hidden, exactly, in the sense of a deliberate concealment. More as though it had been placed there carefully, and then the floorboards had been laid over it for safekeeping. The way people store important documents beneath the floor, when they do not trust a trunk or a shelf. It was a single page, torn along its left edge, which told me it had been removed from something larger, a bound document or a ledger. The paper was old, not old in the way of documents that have been stored carelessly, old in the way of a document that had aged in a stable environment, yellowed at its margins but still intact, still legible. The handwriting in its upper portion was a legal hand, clear and practiced, the kind used by men who drafted land agreements in the 17th century. It described the boundaries of a land parcel in the hill country of northwestern Connecticut, the measurements given in chains and rods in the manner of that period. It identified the grantor as unnamed, described only as the prior claimant. It identified the grantee as Gideon Dudley and his male heirs. It was signed at the bottom in ink, Gideon Dudley's signature, dated in the year 1693. Below that signature, in a different hand, was a second inscription. Not a countersignature in any legal sense. It was not a name. It was a set of terms, written in cramped, close letters that required me to bring the page very near to my face to read. The ink in which these terms were written was darker than the ink above. Not in color exactly, but in quality. It absorbed the light differently. I cannot explain this more precisely, and I recognize that it is not the kind of detail this court will find usable, so I will simply record it as an observation and move on. The terms scratched into the lower portion of that page described an arrangement. I am going to read from my notes of it, which I made immediately after finding it, because I want the court to have the precise language rather than my summary. Continued prosperity and protection of the named parcel against blight, flood, and hostile incursion, in exchange for a rotation of tribute from the occupying family, to be rendered at intervals of the claimant's choosing, in the form of willing presence and sustained attention. The debt to accumulate without diminishment in the event of the named family's departure or extinction, transferring in full to subsequent occupants of the parcel in proportion to the years of their residence. The agreement to remain in force so long as the land holds the boundary. That is what was written. I copied it with care. The page itself I have submitted to this court, and it is, I understand, in your possession. I would ask that it be examined by someone with expertise in 17th century documents, because there are aspects of the lower inscription that I believe merit technical examination. I want to tell the court what I made of this document when I first read it, in that house, in the fading afternoon light of October the 20th, 1746. I thought I was looking at evidence of the Dudley family's eccentricity. Men have written strange things into the margins of legal documents before, particularly in the late 17th century, when the boundary between covenant theology and folk practice was less clear than we might prefer. I thought it was possible that old Gideon Dudley had genuinely believed he was making some form of agreement with the land, or with whatever spiritual power he associated with it, and had committed that belief to paper in an act of private ceremony. I thought it explained nothing about the current situation in any practical sense. I folded the page carefully and placed it in my document case. I told Samuel what I had found. He read it and said it was the most interesting piece of superstitious theater he had come across in a year of circuit work. He said it with affection, as though the long-dead Gideon Dudley were a figure of gentle comedy. He set it down and went back to his examination of the house. That night, the humming began. We had decided to stay overnight in the Clark house rather than ride back to the Prentice farm again. This was a decision I made, and Samuel agreed to readily, because it would allow us to complete our examination of the remaining homesteads the following morning without losing travel time. The Fitches had been uneasy when I told them our plan. Margaret Fitch had looked at me with an expression that I found difficult to interpret at the time and interpret now with more certainty. She had asked us, without explanation, to keep a fire burning through the night. I said we would. We ate from our provisions, kept the fire, and settled in to sleep somewhere after 9 o'clock. The house was quiet in the way that empty houses are quiet, which is a specific quality of silence that anyone who has spent time in them will recognize. Not peaceful silence, attended silence. The kind that makes the sounds outside more audible because there are no interior sounds to compete with them. I was not asleep when it started. I was in the early stages of lying still and quieting my mind, which is the closest I come to a sleep ritual. I heard it first as something I could not immediately place, a sound in the lower registers, below the threshold of clear identification, like a vibration in wood or in the ground itself. I lay still and listened to it for what I believe was several minutes before I understood what it was. Someone humming, or something producing a sound in the pattern of humming. Low and tuneless, in no particular key, the rhythm loose and uneven the way a person hums when they are not consciously doing it. It came from the south, from the direction of the hemlock tree line along the ridge. It was not close. It was perhaps 300 yards distant, somewhere at the edge of the clearing where the trees began. I sat up and looked at Samuel's bedroll. He was awake. He was lying on his back, staring at the ceiling, with the absolute stillness of someone who is trying to determine whether what they are hearing is real. I said, quietly, that I heard it. He said that he did also. I asked him whether it reminded him of anything. He thought for a moment, and said it sounded like something a person would do while walking alone in the dark. I agreed with that characterization. Neither of us moved. After perhaps 20 minutes, the sound faded, not suddenly but gradually, the way a sound does when its source moves away. We did not sleep well that night, but we slept. In the morning I conducted my last examination of the Clark house and the Abbott homestead. Samuel walked the perimeter of the clearing, looking at the edge of the tree line, and came back with a report that unsettled him more than he let on initially. The ground at the base of the hemlocks, in the area facing the Clark house, showed evidence of disturbance. Not tracks in any recognizable sense, not prints, but a compression of the ground cover, the dead needles and moss and matted leaf material that suggested weight had rested there for a period of time. A large weight, in a rough oval perhaps 6 feet in length, as though something had sat or crouched at the tree line for an extended period. Samuel said the compression was fresh. It had rained 2 days before our arrival, and the disturbed area was on top of the rain-pressed surface, not beneath it. I noted this in my journal for that day. I recorded it as evidence of a large animal, possibly a bear, though the shape of the compression was not consistent with bear resting behavior as I understood it. I recorded my uncertainty about that interpretation. I also recorded, because I had committed to thoroughness, that the compression was oriented precisely toward the Clark house window, which faced south. We visited the Fitches that afternoon, our third day in the hollow, and I asked Ezra Fitch about the compression evidence. He said he had seen similar marks at the tree line behind his own house. He said they appeared approximately once a week and had been appearing since July. He said he had checked his traps in the area and found no sign of any animal that would account for them. He said that on the nights following the appearances of the marks, the humming was louder. I asked him whether he had heard anything in the sound that suggested words. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said that his wife believed she had heard her mother's voice in it. His wife's mother had been dead for 11 years. I want the court to note that I am recording this exactly as Fitch stated it. I am not offering it as evidence of anything supernatural. I am recording it as a data point that was relevant to my understanding of the pattern of events. There are known acoustic phenomena in which the human auditory system, particularly under stress and in low-light conditions, resolves ambiguous sounds into recognizable speech or voice. This is a documented tendency. I held that explanation in mind as I noted Fitch's account. I held it in mind until the following night, which was the second night we spent in the Clark house, when I heard my own name in the sound. I need to describe the second night carefully, because this is where the account begins to depart from what I can explain with the tools I arrived with, and I want the court to see that departure clearly. We had returned to the Clark house with our provisions and our fire. It was the evening of October the 21st. We lit the fire as Margaret Fitch had advised us, and we sat with it for an hour after supper, talking. Samuel was in good spirits. He had a theory about the Clark family's departure that centered on a collective panic event triggered by an initial ergot exposure in one family member, spreading through close community contact as a kind of social contagion of fear. This is a reasonable theory, and I told him so. We discussed it at some length, and the discussion was productive. He was a careful thinker, Samuel, when he chose to be. That conversation, in front of that fire, is the last memory I have of him as entirely himself. We went to our bedrolls sometime before 10. The fire was banked but burning. The house was cold in the way that Connecticut hill country houses are cold in October, which is a specific and penetrating cold that enters through the floor and rises. I was wearing my coat as I lay down. The sound started earlier that night. I had been horizontal perhaps 15 minutes when it began, and it was immediately clear that it was closer than the previous night. Not at the tree line, between the tree line and the house, perhaps 150 yards distant. The same quality of sound, low, tuneless, unrhythmic, but louder, and with a quality that I will describe as carefully as I can. It was more structured. The previous night's sound had been entirely formless, the kind of noise that sits below the level of meaning. This night, there was a pattern within it, not a melody, a pattern of emphasis. Certain notes held longer, certain passages repeated, as though there was something within the sound that was trying to find the shape of speech without having yet arrived at it. Samuel was awake. I could tell by his breathing. Neither of us spoke. We lay still and listened. After perhaps 40 minutes, the sound faded. I heard Samuel exhale in a long, slow breath. He said, without moving, that he was going to attribute it to a combination of wind and an overactive imagination, and go to sleep. I said that was a reasonable plan. I do not believe either of us meant it. I slept poorly, woke several times, and in the early morning hours lay awake thinking about the covenant page in my document case. I had been turning the language of the lower inscription over in my mind since I found it. Willing presence and sustained attention. That was the form the tribute took. Not gold, not grain, not livestock. Presence, attention. The thing that had not been paid since the Dudley family died out or departed was not a material thing. It was the act of being there and listening. And I thought, in the dark of that house on the 22nd of October, 1746, that what was advancing nightly through the hemlock trees was collecting a debt. Not randomly, not with the indifference of weather, deliberately, progressively, with a method. It was advancing because it had been approaching this house for some time before our arrival, and our arrival had simply given it new material to work with. I want to be careful here about the difference between what I concluded in that moment and what I am concluding now in this deposition. In that moment, half awake, in a cold and empty house in a cursed hollow, the idea that the sound was purposeful felt like certainty. In the light of day, and in the context of this formal account, I will say only that the behavior of the sound across the 4 nights I experienced it was consistent with purposeful advance. Whether that purpose was the expression of an ancient debt, or the behavior of an animal, or a person with specific territorial intent, I cannot prove. What I can prove is the pattern. Closer each night, more structured each night. And on the 3rd night, The night I need to describe now, it arrived at something that I do not have a materialist explanation for. The third night was October the 22nd. We had spent the day completing our examination of the settlement and drafting notes for the report I intended to submit. I had not yet decided what to do with the Covenant page. Part of my hesitation was practical. I was not certain the Hartford court would know what to make of it. Part of my hesitation was something I do not have a clean name for, a reluctance to formally introduce that document into the record of this case without understanding more about it. I placed this decision in the category of things I would resolve in the morning and set it aside. That night, the sound did not wait until we had settled. It began while we were still sitting by the fire, while the sky outside was not yet fully dark. Samuel heard it first and turned his head toward the south window. I heard it a moment later. We looked at each other across the fire. It was close. Closer than it had been on either previous night. It was at the edge of the clearing, directly outside the south wall of the house, perhaps 40 or 50 feet from the window. I will try to describe it precisely. The sound was in a lower register than the previous nights, which is the opposite of what I would expect from an advancing sound source. When sound moves toward you, it typically resolves into higher clarity and a higher apparent frequency. This sound was dropping, settling into a deeper register, as though it had found something, and within it, in a way that I cannot fully account for, I began to hear syllables. They did not form immediately. It took perhaps 10 minutes of sitting by the fire, listening without speaking, before the syllables resolved into anything I could identify. And then they did. My name, not spoken, not called out in a voice, hummed. The pattern of emphasis within the tuneless sound had arranged itself around the syllables of my name, Caleb Marsh, in a way that could not have been coincidence or auditory projection, because I heard it repeat 3 times before I was certain I had heard it, and on each repetition, the emphasis was identical and precise. I looked at Samuel. He had gone very still. His face was oriented toward the window, toward the south, and his expression was one I had not seen on him before. Not fear exactly, absorption. The same quality Fitch had described in Gideon Clark, standing at his property edge in the dusk, listening to something that was not there for anyone else. I asked him what he heard. He did not answer immediately. When he did, he said he heard his mother. He said this quietly, without distress, in the tone of someone identifying something they expected. His mother was alive and resident in Hartford. She had not been in this hollow. What he heard could not have been his mother. But he said it with complete certainty, and his certainty was more alarming to me than anything else that had happened in that house. I want the court to understand that this was the moment at which my ergot framework became untenable, not because of what I heard, because of what Samuel heard. We were in the same room, by the same fire, exposed to the same air and the same conditions, and we were each hearing something different within the same sound. I was hearing my name. He was hearing his mother's voice. That is not consistent with ergot contamination or with any auditory disturbance that operates on the listener uniformly. It is consistent with something that operates on each listener individually, selecting from their own interior what will be most effective. I said his name sharply. He turned his head toward me, and for a moment his expression cleared. I said we needed to move away from the window. He agreed, and we pulled our chairs back toward the center of the room, away from the south wall. He said, after a moment, that he was sorry, that he had known it was not real, that it had still been her voice. The sound continued for another hour. It did not come closer, but it did not recede. We sat by the fire and did not speak much, and waited for it to stop. When it did, it stopped completely, not gradually, not a fading, but a cessation, as though a signal had been extinguished. The silence that followed had a different quality from any silence I have experienced before or since. Not relief. Attention turned elsewhere. I did not sleep that night. I sat by the fire and read through my notes and thought about the Covenant page, and thought about what I was going to put in the report I sent to the circuit board and to the Hartford court. I decided, sometime before dawn on the 23rd of October, that I was going to recommend that the ecclesiastical inquiry formally investigate the founding documents of the Dudleytown settlement, that I was going to submit the covenant page as evidence, that I was going to be precise and clinical and thorough and resist every impulse to reach for language that the court would find disqualifying. I decided all of this in the last hours before dawn, sitting in a dead family's house in a hollow that something ancient had been circling for longer than any of the current settlers had been alive. I had almost decided to wake Samuel and tell him we should leave before the next nightfall when he woke himself, just before dawn, and came to sit beside the fire. He looked tired but composed. He said good morning. I said good morning. He asked whether I had slept. I said no. He said he had, a little, and that his dreams had been quiet. We spent the fourth day, the 23rd of October, completing the documentation of the settlement. I wanted to speak with the Fitches again before we left, and I wanted to examine the exterior of the hemlock tree line one more time in daylight. Samuel accompanied me on both tasks. At the tree line I found what I expected to find, another compression mark, larger than the previous one, this time within the clearing itself, rather than at the tree edge. Something had come inside the boundary of the open ground. The disturbance was perhaps 30 feet from the Clark house wall, oriented toward the south window. I measured the compression as best I could. The disturbed area was approximately 8 feet in its longest dimension. I have no reliable comparison for what could produce a resting compression of that size. I noted this in my journal. I did not share the measurement with Samuel immediately, because I was watching his reaction to the clearing, and his reaction was wrong. He was not looking at the compression. He was looking at the tree line. Standing at the edge of the disturbed ground, looking into the hemlock trees with the same quality of absorption I had seen on his face the previous evening. He was not humming. He was silent, but his lips were moving slightly, the way a person's lips move when they are listening to something and forming the words they hear without quite speaking them. I said his name. He came back immediately, turned, looked at me with a clean and present expression. He said he had been thinking. I said about what? He hesitated, and then said about the sound from last night and what it had sounded like, and whether there was a way to find out if there was a person producing it. I said we were going to look at the tree line, and then speak with Fitch, and then make plans for the evening. He agreed readily enough. At the Fitch house, I had the conversation that produced what I consider the most important contextual information I gathered on this visit, and which I have reproduced above in this deposition. Ezra Fitch, when I showed him the covenant page, looked at it for a long time without speaking. His wife came to look over his shoulder and made a sound that I can only describe as a sound of confirmation, as though the page explained something she had long suspected. Fitch asked me where I had found it. I told him. He said he had heard that old Gideon Dudley had written something into the land record, that it was local knowledge of a vague kind, but that no one had seen the document. He then told me something I want the court to note carefully. He said that the pattern of troubles in the Dudleytown Hollow had not been continuous. It had been periodic. The worst of it had come in clusters, separated by periods of relative quiet. He believed the clusters corresponded to periods of increased settlement within the hollow, and the quiet periods to times when the land was more sparsely occupied. He framed this tentatively, as a pattern he had noticed rather than a conclusion he had drawn, but the implication was clear to me. Whatever the arrangement described in the covenant required, it required witnesses, occupants, willing presence and sustained attention. When the hollow was empty, the debt accumulated without collection. When new families moved in, the collection resumed. We had been in the hollow for 4 days. 4 days of sustained attention, of sitting in the Clark house and listening. I did not share this interpretation with Fitch, but I thought it as I rode back to the Clark house that evening. In the last copper light of an October afternoon in the hill country, with the hemlocks standing dark above the ridge, and the hollow below us receiving the dusk, as it always received it, earlier than anywhere else. Samuel was quiet on the ride back. He had been quieter all day than was usual for him, and I had been attributing this to fatigue and to the cumulative effect of the previous nights. He said, as we turned down the track into the hollow, that he thought we should stay one more night rather than leaving before dark. He gave a reason, that he wanted to conduct one more examination of the Abbott House's storage building, which we had not fully inventoried. This was a legitimate task, and I agreed, and I want the court to understand that I agreed without suspicion, because his stated reason was reasonable, and because I did not yet understand what was already happening to him. We ate, we kept the fire, the light failed outside, the hemlock ridge disappeared into the dark. We sat. The sound began at full dark. It was not at the tree line. It was outside the south wall of the house, not 40 feet, closer, perhaps 20 feet, perhaps 15. The kind of distance at which a person standing outside could hear a conversation within the house if the voices were raised. It was louder than any previous night, and it had completed the progression I had been observing. It was no longer tuneless in any meaningful sense. It had the structure of speech. Not speech exactly, not words in the way I am speaking to you now, but the rhythm and emphasis of words, the cadence of a sentence, repeated, repeating. I heard my name within it again, more clearly than the previous night, and I heard something else. I heard words that I had not spoken aloud since the previous evening, when Samuel and I had spoken by the fire, words from our conversation, not repeated back verbatim, exactly, but recognizably similar, arranged in the same order, in the cadence and register of my own voice, as I might hear it if I were standing slightly away from myself. It was speaking in my voice, approximately, in the way that a person who has heard you speak at length begins to approximate your patterns, without quite mastering them. I want to state that clearly for the court, because this is the element I found most destabilizing, and I want the record to be precise. The sound outside the Clark house on the night of October the 23rd had begun to speak in a version of my voice, using fragments of my words from recent conversations, in a repetitive, circling pattern. It was not a perfect mimicry, but it was close enough that my body understood it as my own voice, before my mind had processed what was happening. I turned to Samuel. He was sitting up in his bedroll, on top of it rather than inside it. He was fully dressed, including his boots. His eyes were open and oriented toward the south wall. His lips were moving again, more clearly now than they had been in the clearing. He was forming words. After a moment, I understood that he was responding to the sound outside, not aloud, just the shapes of words with his lips, as though he were having a conversation he could not quite bring himself to speak. I said his name. He turned his head toward me immediately, and his expression was clear, present, aware. He knew where he was. He knew who I was. And he said, in a voice that was entirely his own, calm and almost matter-of-fact, that he thought he needed to go outside. I said, "You will not go outside." He said he thought he recognized the voice, and wanted to speak with the person. I told him there was no person. I told him what I had been hearing in the sound, my own name, fragments of my own speech, and I asked him what he was hearing. He thought about this for a moment, and then said he was hearing his mother ask him to come out and speak with her. He said it as though this were a reasonable thing to say. He was not confused. He was not incoherent. He was applying perfectly intact cognition to a completely distorted perception of what was outside that wall. I talked to him for approximately 30 minutes, keeping my voice level and my arguments practical. I said his mother was in Hartford. I said the sound had been advancing for 4 nights and had been doing the same to other families in this hollow for longer than we had been alive. I said the covenant page described a process of tribute that involved willing presence, and that walking toward the sound was exactly what the thing outside the wall was arranging. He listened to all of this. He nodded at points. He said he understood. And then the sound changed. I cannot describe the change adequately in language, but I will try. It did not become louder. It became more specific. The approximation of my voice that had been circling in the humming tightened, resolved, and for a period of perhaps 30 seconds, It was not an approximation. It was my voice, exactly, speaking words I had said to Samuel not 2 hours before, during supper, in the same rhythm and the same intonation, without error. And within that exact reproduction of my voice, it addressed him. It said, in the words I had spoken at supper but rearranged, with different emphasis, that he should come out and see. The effect on me of hearing my exact voice coming from the dark outside that wall, saying words I had said, rearranged into an invitation I had not intended, was not something I have adequate language for in this deposition. I will say that I felt, for approximately 5 seconds, the same thing Samuel had been experiencing, a pull toward the source of the sound, a sense that the sound was oriented specifically at me, was for me, had found something in me, that it was pressing on. And then I pressed back against it, consciously, deliberately, and it released. I do not know why I was able to do that in that moment when Samuel had not been able to do it across an entire day. I suspect it was because I had heard my own name in it early enough to identify the mechanism, to know what it was doing. Samuel had heard his mother, which is a different kind of claim on a person. Samuel stood up. He did it in a single movement, without hesitation, the way a person stands who has made a decision and intends to carry it through before they can reconsider. He was taller than me by several inches, and he crossed the room in 3 strides. I caught his arm at the door. I had his forearm in both my hands. I am not a small man. He was larger. The sound was inside the sound then, not outside the wall. Present in the room, or in some register that the wall was not enough to exclude. What I mean is that it had become loud enough, or close enough, that the house was not a sufficient barrier. And it was still doing what it had been doing, circling in my voice, calling to him with my words, rearranged. And then it was also doing something new. It was in a second voice beneath mine, a woman's voice, lower and closer to song, saying his name, drawing out the syllable of it in a way that made it sound like an answer to a question. I held his arm for 30 seconds, maybe a few seconds more. He pulled, not violently, steadily. The way a person pulls when they are not trying to escape a captor but simply moving towards something they intend to reach. And the sound in the room was building toward something, a resolution, the way a sentence builds toward its final word, and I understood at that moment with complete and awful clarity, that if I held on until that resolution, until whatever the sound was completing, the thing outside the wall would have both of us, not one. That my grip on his arm was becoming less an act of rescue and more an act of proximity. That the sound was already testing the edges of my resistance the way it had tested Samuel's for an entire day. I let go. I let go of his arm, and I stepped back 2 steps, and I watched Samuel Hoit open the door of the Clark house and walk out into the dark toward the Hemlock Ridge, and the sound rose for a moment as he stepped through the threshold, a single sustained note, and then it ceased. The silence that followed was absolute. More complete than any silence I have experienced in my life, as though sound itself had been withdrawn from the hollow entirely, every insect, every creak sound, every night wind, removed. I stood in the middle of the room for a long time. I do not know how long. I did not go after him. I want the court to understand the decision I made and the reasons for it, and I want the court to understand that I have been examining those reasons every day since October the 23rd, and I have not yet determined whether they constitute a defensible judgment or a failure. I did not go after him because I believed that walking toward the tree line in the dark in that hollow, toward the thing that had just successfully extracted a man from a locked and firelit room, was a form of offering myself that would result in my death or my permanent loss of sanity. And that if both of us were in the hollow, neither account of what had happened there would ever reach the Hartford court, and the covenant page would remain beneath the Clark house floor, undiscovered, and the hollow would continue to consume whoever settled in it. That is the reasoning I applied. I applied it in approximately 10 seconds, and then I went to my horse and I rode out. I will tell the court what I saw as I crossed the clearing. I saw the door to the Clark house standing open. I saw the south wall of the house, and beyond it, the tree line, and in the tree line, at the edge of the hemlocks, I saw Samuel Hoit standing. He was standing with his back to me, facing into the trees. He was not moving. He was not making any sound that I could hear. And beside him, or behind him, or at some distance from him that the dark did not allow me to measure precisely, there was a shape, not a shape I can describe in dimensions or in form. A presence in the dark that was not a tree, and was not a person, but that occupied space in the way those things occupy space, with weight, with intention. It did not move as I rode past. Neither did Samuel. I rode through the night. I reached the Prentice farm before dawn and woke the household and asked them to send a man to Cornwall. I reached Cornwall myself by mid-morning on the 24th and delivered my initial report to the parish office. A search party went into the hollow on the 25th of October. They found the Clark house as we had left it. Fire burned out, both bedrolls on the floor. They found no sign of Samuel Hoit inside or outside the house. They searched the hemlock tree line and the area beyond it to a distance of roughly half a mile and found no sign of him. They found a compression in the ground at the tree edge, at the point where I had seen him standing. It was the largest compression yet documented in the hollow, covering an area of perhaps 12 feet in its longest dimension. Samuel Hoit has not been found. I was informed of this last month, and it is the reason I asked the circuit board to formally request this deposition, rather than wait for a written summary. I wanted to state in a legal forum, in the presence of witnesses, that Samuel Hoit walked out of that house of his own volition in the technical sense, that no person compelled him, that I held his arm and then released it and watched him go, and that the decision to release him was mine alone. I also want to state that he was not himself when he walked out. He was not making a free choice in any meaningful sense. He was answering something that had been working on him for 4 days with specific and deliberate intent. I do not think those two statements cancel each other. I think they are both true, and I think I will carry both of them. Let me now address the broader questions this court has asked me to answer, because beyond the events I have described, there are 3 questions that the Hartford Ecclesiastical Inquiry formally put to me, and I want the court to have my answers on the record. The first question is whether I believe the Dudleytown Hollow should remain accessible to settlement. My answer is no. I believe the pattern documented here, the repeated collapse of settler families across multiple generations and multiple family lines, the psychological deterioration consistent across demographically different populations, the physical evidence at the tree line, and the Covenant page's account of an ongoing and accumulating debt, together constitute a sufficient basis for formally recommending that the hollow not be settled or accessed. I recognize this recommendation has significant implications for the land claims involved, and I am offering it as a professional judgment, not a legal ruling. The second question is whether I believe the Covenant page to be authentic. I believe the upper portion is an authentic 17th century legal document. The lower inscription is more difficult to assess. I have no expertise in the physical analysis of ink or paper. I have noted, in my testimony above, that the ink of the lower inscription appeared to absorb light differently from the ink above it. I am aware that this observation is not scientifically useful in its current form. I would ask the court to commission an expert examination of the page. The third question is what I believe the sound I heard to have been. I have thought about this question since the 23rd of October, and I do not have an answer I am prepared to give under oath, in terms that assign it a specific identity or origin. What I can say, under oath, is that the sound was purposeful, that it advanced consistently and deliberately over 4 nights, that it operated individually on each listener, accessing personal content that it had no observable way of obtaining, that it was capable of reproducing human speech with high fidelity, and that its behavior was precisely consistent with the terms of the lower inscription on the Covenant page, specifically the language about willing presence and sustained attention and the collection of accumulated debt from occupants of the parcel. Whether the entity responsible for the sound is what the founding Dudley family believed they were contracting with in 1693, I cannot say. I can say that its behavior is consistent with an entity that believes it is collecting what it is owed. The covenant page is in the possession of this court. I ask that it be preserved and that its terms be considered in any future disposition of the Dudleytown land parcel. I have given this deposition to the best of my knowledge and my ability to observe and report. I have withheld nothing. I have not embellished. I have identified, at every point where I could, the distinction between what I observed and what I interpreted, and I have flagged where those distinctions became difficult to maintain. Samuel Hoit was 22 years old. He was a careful thinker when he chose to be. He laughed easily. He had ridden south with me, in good weather on the first day of October, full of reasonable explanations for everything, and he had been right to have them. The hollow had simply required 4 days to find the particular thing in him that would make him walk toward it. I have ridden the circuit since I returned from Dudleytown. I have done my work. I have given this deposition. I am going to go home and sit in a room that does not face south and write a letter to Samuel Hoyt's mother, which is the 3rd letter I have drafted, and the first I may actually send. And I am going to listen every evening for the particular sound I carry with me now, the one that occasionally rises in my memory at dusk, low and tuneless and circling, resolving, as I lie still and wait for it to stop, into something almost but not quite like my own voice asking me to come out. It has not yet been close enough to act on. I do not know what I will do when it is. I have not been brave enough to decide that yet. The covenant page is your problem now. Keep it somewhere without windows.